legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Brian Francis Culkin, who joins us to discuss his book, The Meaning of Trump. The election of Donald Trump was a shattering moment for the political sensibilities of America, immediately sending the country into a frenzy of rage, disbelief and invective amid a never-ending media circus that has bordered on the absurd and arguably crossed the line. But the question still remains, what does it all mean? The Meaning of Trump is an ideological critique that sees the election of Donald Trump as a completely natural progression to the general trajectory of digitized technologies, neoliberalism, and a new breed of financialized capitalism. Destructive global forces that know no party affiliation or national boundary. Although Donald Trump is undoubtedly the symptom that has exploded to the surface after nearly 4 decades of failed policies and broken promises by both Republicans and Democrats alike, his election can also be seen as an existential fork in the road for both the United States and even humanity itself. What path is taken still remains to be seen.
Hello and welcome, Brian, and thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, today, Brian, we're going to be discussing a recent book of yours. The Meaning of Trump is simply the title. Listeners are already going to be aware of the main subject of this discussion, where we're going with it. Before we jump into it, however, tell listeners a little bit about your background and your work in general.
Yeah, so my name is Brian Francis Culkin. I am a writer, a film director, and a theorist. I always kind of cringe when I say that because it sounds so pretentious. But a theorist is basically, it's a way of trying to explain the world that we live in. And it's a type of philosophy that draws on multidisciplines, from anthropology, linguistics, understanding technology, history, and more, to try to make sense of the world or theorize the world that we find ourselves in. And I think that is actually a very important task right now in the very confusing era that we're living in of planetary globalization. The world is under-theorized. And I think, so that's part of my book. I've written now 10 books, and I've directed 3 films, and I'm working on my first novel and a couple other theoretical texts for next year. And that's basically it.
Okay. Now, besides all of the hand-wringing and arm-waving and invective and also some cheering that came in the wake of the election of Donald Trump as US president, there was a lot of disbelief and confusion. How did this happen? What does this mean? How could this happen? What do we do next? For both Trump opponents and his supporters. Many of his supporters, of course, equally surprised as his opponents. And your book attempts to take a little bit of a sideways look at it, hence the title, The Meaning of Trump. What does this mean? But also bring in, as under your rubric of theorist, bring in some other threads to try and explain what's going on. First things first, however, I remember a lot of people have written about similarities between the Brexit phenomenon, where the United Kingdom voted to depart the European Union, and the election of Trump. They've drawn parallels between the two. And I remember sitting up on the Brexit vote evening, stayed up as long as I could before I just had to go to sleep. And it was just at the point I went to bed when it was looking like, you know what? This may not go the way all the mainstream pundits are saying. So as far as the election of Trump goes, I mean, what were your feelings in the run-up to the election, how the campaigns were conducted, and, where were you on the night? And at what point did you think, whoa, this guy could actually be our next president?
Sure. But to your point, I think you're correct in the sense that there is a similarity between the energy behind electing Donald Trump and voting for Brexit. I think in a way you could make a comparison between Hillary Clinton being representative of the bureaucracy of the European Union, and in the case of voting for the Trump, and in case of voting for voting for Brexit, there was a social desire that for a lot of people who really maybe have felt underrepresented over the past couple of decades to try to somehow mobilize a political will to escape from that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong or whatever, but I think that is absolutely a fair comparison of us seeing Trump and Brexit as being part of the same political phenomena that we're now seeing in the second decade of the 21st century, now moving into the third decade. But in terms of it was shocking. It was absolutely shocking. I still remember exactly where I was the night he was elected. It's one of those things, not quite like 9/11, but it's something that I'll always remember where I was when Donald Trump was elected, because it was truly shocking. I think my experience, at least, of seeing Trump announcing his candidacy to the election to actually being elected in November 2016 was this kind of amazement that this guy just the fact that he announced his presidency was somewhat of it was a joke. A lot of the late night comedians and a lot of people who comment on pop American culture were kind of making jokes at this. This is a publicity stunt. This is a scam for his apprentice show or something like that. And then when he started to win and started to mobilize a really, really devoted base of constituents, then people were like, what's going? It was very hard to make sense of what was happening. I don't think anyone ever thought he was actually going to beat Hillary Clinton, especially when the video was released in, I believe it was September, October of 2016, when he was openly admitting sexual assault and basically laughing about it. Then about 2 to 3 weeks later, when then FBI Director James Comey reopened the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, that gave him a little bit of support and energy to try to somehow win. And the night he actually did, it was one of the most shocking moments maybe in the history of American presidential politics, actually.
Well, there's two main things there, really. One is that, Hillary Clinton's campaign was dismal, as far as I'm concerned. Not only did she continue to, as a lot of the Democratic establishment did, continue to take their base for granted, continue to demonize the Republican base. They were continuing to ignore this huge mass of the population in red and blue states, actually, who'd been disregarded. There was a lot of traditional Republican voters and traditional Democrat voters who felt largely the same way, actually. That there was a sort of, metropolitan elites and coastal dwelling elites had been taking them for granted and ignoring them for decades. And it was kind of like not seeing that coming, or even as it was appearing over the horizon, in this case in the guise of Trump, not taking it seriously, right down to the moment when they got a bloody nose.
Yes, that is absolutely true. It is true on two different levels, both practically and ideologically. On the practical level, Clinton essentially ignored these key states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania that you just assumed would be voting for the Democratic Party because historically they had. And ideologically, the Democratic Party, back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, has always been associated with labor, and you could say the blue collar workers of America. That has, without question, shifted in recent years. And with Trump, you really see a crescendo of that, where working class, mainly white voters, which had been, so many of these people that voted for Trump in 2016, their grandparents were all part of FDR's New Deal. They were lifelong kind of blue collar Democrats. And there's been the Democratic Party since the 90s there's been a slow rupture with that working class base. and it's moved into, as you said, coastal elites. And rather with dealing with discrepancies in class, it has moved into the field of what we term as identity politics, dealing with the figures in gender and sexuality and race. Not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, but they have fundamentally dislocated themselves from the traditional questions of economic production, and that has affected these blue collar voters in places like Michigan and Indiana and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. These were the key states that turned to Donald Trump in the 2016 election. And and to your point, Hillary Clinton, just forget about the movement of the Democratic Party's political ideology. Practically speaking, she didn't campaign in these places, and Trump did. So he put energy and money and intention into these places, and it paid off. It paid off in the Electoral College of November of 2016.
In many ways, Trump, there was lots of people within the Republican Party and the Republican establishment, even the Republican base, who just couldn't identify with Trump at all. So in many ways, he's hitched his wagon to the Republican Party because that was kind of the least worst fit, so to speak. And in some ways, he's almost like these other characters, historical characters, Ralph Nader and Ron Paul, who, and even Bernie Sanders to an extent, who are kind of outside of that establishment system, but they have sometimes stood as independently, but other times I thought, well, I should pitch my lot in with, red or blue, because one of those is going to come out on top, which obviously does happen. But with Trump, there was almost another level on top of that. Not only was he not really a fit, as a non-politician for any of the main camps, he himself is just so unpredictable,
absolutely,
so mercurial,
absolutely,
so contradictory that people just couldn't handle him, because not only could he just change his mind, his position on things on the, turn of a dime, and people say, whoa, we don't know how to deal. How do we react to this? How do we cope with this? But he could also do the aforementioned things, about be involved in scandal or disgrace and seemingly be apparently untouched by that.
Yeah. I think the big differential between Trump and, someone like Ron Paul or Sanders is that with Sanders and Ron Paul, and they're coming at things from totally different angles, is you have a real strong ideological commitment. With Paul, you have this real strong commitment to libertarianism and theorists like Murray Rothbard and Lew Rockwell, free market economics, and he just kind of was even though he was by no means a Republican, he associated himself with that party. And the same as Sanders, who is not a Democrat in the way we think of American Democrats. He is a socialist, but he associates himself. Well, actually, Sanders is an independent. He's not even though he's running for the Democratic nomination, he's always been an independent senator from Vermont. Whereas Trump kind of goes with the wind. I think in some ways, Donald Trump is a definition of a coastal elite. So in some ways, he is very much associated with certain aspects of Democratic Party politics. And then in other ways, mainly for his free market, his kind of radical right-wing free market economics, he's more associated with the Republican Party. Where he diverges with the Republican Party most obvious is in his personal life. The Republican Party wants to have this appearance of family values and some kind of connection to history, you could say. Whereas Trump is fundamentally he's a brand. He's not even really a human being anymore. He's a Twitter avatar. He's a corporate brand. And so that's the fissure with that part of the conservative, like the morally conservative aspect of the Republican Party. But yeah, no, Trump's a wild card. He's always been a wild card in his business life and his political life. And he's a classic opportunist. And he's a good one at that. He's the leader of the free world right now. So yes, I would agree with your analysis of his, in one sense, his similarity to people like Ron Paul and Sanders in the sense that he's an outsider, but then he differentiates in his lack of ideological nuance and political commitment.
Well, as you just alluded to, that one of the ironies of all this is that Trump is kind of a product of a process. He's part of a series of meta trends that he kind of is claiming to be against in a way. And it's, again, it's kind of fits with his whole oeuvre, really, this contradictory nature. But of course, a lot of his supporters don't see it like that. They'll hear Trump making pronouncements against this and against that, making America great again, reestablishing various industries. But of course, he himself has emerged from the process that offshored and destroyed these industries and what have you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, he's the representation of privatization and deregulation, certainly in the New York City real estate market, but he could also be representative of that on the national level as well. So he is the symbol of the thing. The paradox of Trump is that the people he mobilized into his political base, the unemployed coal miner in West Virginia, the auto worker in Detroit, I mean, he is symbolic of the very socioeconomic forces that have displaced these people from their former position. He is a symbol of the forces that have eroded the American middle class over the past 30 years. I mean, that's the real paradox of the situation, is that he is about as far away from a Detroit auto worker as you can possibly get.
Now, I think it's clear that Trump was going to employ his armory of skills and talents, whether you want to use those words or not, but the things that he's learned in life so far and that's taken him to whatever success he has had, he's going to deploy those in the electoral process and then again in his role as president. And it's not unusual for people to enter politics from business or whatever.
It's becoming more common. It's becoming more and more common over the past 20 years, but it's not as common historically in America. It's becoming more of a thing now, definitely, for a businessman to become a presidential candidate.
Yeah, and of course, politics is expensive. Campaigning in the US is very expensive. So if you've got your own war chest, then that puts you ahead, puts you at an advantage straight away, doesn't it? But I can see him using, and you see this in his public pronouncements, and when you see him meeting other world leaders, when you see him debating, using the same tactics to disorientate his opponents, to almost mesmerize them in a way. And so I've read commentary where people have even said, daft little things. He'll come out with these absurd statements, and they stop people in their tracks. And meanwhile, they're losing their train of thought. They're completely destabilized by the man, even right down to his ridiculous hair. It's somehow taking your attention away. It's like a stage magician, saying,
Sure.
look over here.
Sure,
Meanwhile,
sure.
He's doing the real magic elsewhere.
Yeah, Trump understands the new media horizon really, really well. He doesn't understand it intellectually. He doesn't understand it at all on a theoretical level, but from a gut level, from a purely intuitive level, he really understands how Twitter works. He understands how reality television works. He understands what gets people's attention, and there is a Houdini-like quality to him. These other candidates are hiring all these polling people and all these, they're employing all these new sophisticated models of gathering data and metrics, and Trump's really just thinking from his gut. He has this kind of core understanding of what people want, and I'm not saying he's right. I'm not saying it's good or bad or anything else, but he has a real understanding of how the new media horizon functions and how he can brand himself within that horizon. He understands how he can get his image and name and his message, his tweet out there quickly that people will stop and listen to.
Yeah, and some of it's almost Orwellian, isn't it? In a way, the self-contradiction. It's like black is white and up is down. And, Eurasia has always been at war with East Asia one day. And then next day, Eurasia has never been at war with East Asia. Yeah, but Mr. President, you said, never mind what I said. We've never been at war with East Asia.
Sure. Yeah, it remembers 1984 in terms of the content, but not really the form. What I mean by that is that the world we live in right now is nothing like 1984 because we're allowed to say whatever we want and do what we want. And whereas 1984 was like a totalitarian repressive state, where we live in kind of a neoliberal permissive state. But at the same time, the breakdown between signifier and signified, the breakdown of language is opening up a space where this idea that we're living in a post-truth era is speaking to this really strange phenomenon that's happening right now, where we're not quite able to articulate what's actually happening in concrete social reality. There's a mixture between what we see in our computer screen and our iPhone and what's actually happening in the world, and that's allowing for Trump to have these big brother Orwellian statements where he can contradict himself, say one thing, contradict himself the next minute. And people, yes, of course, people are saying it's not true, but it's still somehow working. It's still somehow, he's still able to somehow speak to a political base that's listening.
It recalls, was it Bill Clinton who said in response to being grilled about an incident or whatever, said, well, it depends on what your definition of is. It was that kind of,
Sure.
breakdown of language,
Sure. No, I mean, that's really what it is. It's a breakdown of language, first and foremost.
And we think in terms of language. When we have ideas, we hear a voice in our head, or we talk to ourselves. That's where all the concepts that we deal with are mediated in terms of language quite often. Didn't used to be like that, of course. But when a language arrived, that changed everything. And that's how we mediate these things now. So if that starts to break down or morph and change, then
it's morphing into ones and zeros. It's in the process of morphing into computational language. And we're in this kind of interim period where there's great confusion right now, because we're in the process, whereas the world as we know it is being slowly, not actually slowly, rapidly being mediated by computational language and microelectronic technologies. And that is creating a kind of panic in the collective brain of society.
And of course, people have become very frustrated, increasingly so throughout politics in the late 20th century, now into the early 21st, with politicians who can't appear to say what they actually think about things. Politicians hedging their bets or using weasel words and trying to keep the doors open and not burn any bridges so they can kind of have their cake and eat it. And even if you think it's total gibberish, Trump is for some people refreshing, because he'll tell you what he thinks. This is wrong, and this is how it should be. I hate that guy. This guy is a great guy, and it's that level of black and white, and it's kind of like meme magic. It's kind of like, could just boil it down for me, I don't want to think about anything too complex. And Trump does that.
Yes, he does. And that, I think, has to do as well with the breakdown of basic decency and the breakdown of manners and the breakdown of, the more and more that we interact through our technological devices without having contact with the people around us in our lives, basic manners, formality becomes a thing of the past, and we can, quote unquote, tell it like it is. But telling it like it is not always a good thing. It also is obscene and rude and vulgar. And I think, one of the problems with Trump is he is breaking down the symbolic dignity of the presidency. In terms of your point about politicians not really taking a stand anymore, that has a lot to do, at least in my opinion, of how the political process has been effectively subsumed by the global market, where politicians don't really stand for ideas anymore in the grand sense of the word. They're more like business managers. They're more like CEOs, you could say. So they don't have there aren't these really big dreams anymore that politicians of old had. Politicians today are much more akin to businessmen than they are to politicians in the classical sense of the word.
Yes, there, in many cases in Western capitalist sort of democracies, there kind of are representatives at the table with corporate CEOs.
Sure.
They mediate between the corporations and the voter or the man in the street, because we don't have an opportunity to do that ourselves.
And that's exactly why they're not willing to say things that mean something. They want to find out, they want to say things that don't offend people. They want to say things that can somehow leverage themselves in terms of their negotiating power with these corporations or with the people in their own political party that they can get funds for to do something in their district.
Perhaps, given some of the points that you've touched upon in the last few minutes, this might be the time to introduce concept that it comes in the early part of your book, people of the book versus the people of the screen. So just tell us where that comes from and what the relevance of that is to your thesis.
Yeah, so that was a concept that I got from a book written by Kevin Kelly, who is actually the founder of Wired magazine. He's kind of a one of these early 1990s technology prophets, you could say. And it's from his 2016 book called The Inevitable, where it's basically a book about speaking about the inevitability of global technology taking over all facets of human existence. And one of the things he speaks about in this book, he kind of divides humanity in half between what he terms the people of the book, and the other half is what he terms the people of the screen. And the people of the book, for Kelly, are people who are still linked. You know, these are usually older people that are still linked in some ways to what we could term analog society or the operation of industrial capitalism. They still read the newspaper. They still read books. They still watch the nightly news. They're still linked to this society that was before the internet came about. And the people of the screen tend to be younger people, although there might be some older people as well, but they have a fidelity to digital society, the values of global capitalism, and kind of the fluidification of social roles, you could say. So in many ways, what you saw in 2016 was a kind of referendum between the people of the book, who were absolutely in the corner of Trump, and the people of the screen, who tend to be forward thinking and have maybe at least think of themselves as being politically progressive, who were in the camp of Clinton. The true paradox of that situation is that Donald Trump is the ultimate man of the screen. I mean, he is the ultimate Twitter avatar. He is a reality television icon. He signifies all of these material processes and things that are associated with the people of the screen. And but he spoke directly to the anxieties of the people of the book. He spoke to their problems. He spoke to their concerns. So that, I think, is the real critical point. And we touched on this earlier, is that Trump is the representation of all these things that his own political base doesn't like. But through his, to use your term, his Houdini-like stagemanship, he was able to speak to their anxieties, speak in these very simplified political terms, and mobilize them into an incredibly loyal, I mean, unbelievably loyal political base. You will never find more loyal people than Trump supporters. It's incredible.
Yeah, and of course, it's worth mentioning, and a lot of people listening to this will be a bit like you and I think, identifying themselves to some extent with both of those camps. So, you know, the book and screen, it's a bit like these delineations they have of like boomers and Gen X and Gen Z and all that. It's not hard and fast. It's just an attempt to categorize and to understand something. We did speak about this in the past. I do find myself as someone, you know, obviously grew up with the book, but took to the screen, early adopter, not steeped in it, of course. So I find myself straddling two worlds in that sense. So I understand a little bit about those who identify themselves 100% in either of those camps.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I'm kind of, I'm not a Generation X. I'm younger than that, but I'm like right at the millennial border. So I'm not quite a millennial either. I feel kind of caught in between two worlds as well. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think like anything, there are usually, in terms of using the people of the book, people of the screen dichotomy, there are emancipatory aspects of each and there are repressive aspects of each. I mean, certainly people of the screen, there are without question, and we're seeing this emerge very clearly recently, there are repressive, even totalitarian elements of screen society. And that's just from the surplus of technology and surveillance and all these things that these very large technology corporations are doing to communities across the world.
I was just thinking about there have been more than one TV drama show based around politics, specifically even in the White House, following the titular president. And I could totally see a world, this would be a bit like Mike Judge's film Idiocracy, where if Trump had been able to, and this may yet happen, that he would have a reality TV show broadcast from the White House,
Yeah.
And it would be called The White House, with Donald Trump, brought to you by Burger King or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm surprised it hasn't happened, actually.
There was a point that you made fairly early on in your book about, I believe, many of the Trump supporters, people who eventually voted for him, is that they were struggling to articulate their problem and what it was that they really wanted. And Brexit, as I mentioned close to the top of the hour, a lot of the people who voted for the UK to depart the European Union either were very much in the same boat, kind of would struggle to articulate what the issue was, or they would have a laundry list of complaints that they'd kind of taken straight from pro-Brexit politicians. And in the same light, I heard a lot of, at the run-up to Trump's election, I heard a lot of, and this has happened subsequently, of course, since he's become president, a lot of his supporters articulating their own worldview through the words of Donald Trump and his campaign managers, saying, we don't know what needs to be done, or we're not quite sure, it's the immigrants, or, it's the Chinese or whatever. And then you'd hear them dutifully reading off these talking points from a manifesto saying, this is what the problem is and this is what needs to be done. So again, similar parallels in those two processes, but it was just interesting, the initial thought of them kind of having this the vague sense of unease, but not really knowing why.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a structure of the contemporary world order right now, is there is a lack of what we could term a cognitive map, which is basically just a coherent sense of how the world works, what's happening on a day-to-day basis. I think that's very much lacking today, not just in terms of understanding politics and macro issues, but even in day-to-day life. There's tremendous confusion right now. Trump, I don't necessarily think he provides, by any stretch of the imagination, a coherent cognitive map for people, but he does provide a very simplified map of the world. It's so-and-so's fault. It's, and he even does this with his nicknames that he gives people, Crooked Hillary and so on and so forth.
Rocket Man.
So Trump does provide a sense of, even though he calls himself a stable genius, even though he doesn't seem to be very stable, he does, strangely enough, for his base, provide a sense of order, provide a sense of meaning, you could say, for the contemporary situation right now in the United States of America and even the world for some people.
Well, a return to the past was a recurring theme with Trump and in politics currently this side of the pond. And there will be no return to the past in the way that a lot of the people who want to see it, but that's not going to happen. And of course, the irony we spoke about earlier applies here as well, which is Trump talking about making America great again, harking back to halcyon days, when he himself has been a huge disruptor of all of that.
Sure. I think, to what I was saying earlier, is we are in a transitionary period right now in the early decades of the 21st century. We're caught between two worlds. We're caught between analog and digital society. We're caught between the discourses of industrial capitalism and the discourses of post-industrial neoliberal capitalism or globalized capitalism. So there is a very strong sense right now for nostalgia. There is a very strong sense of a need. There is this nostalgia for the old way of the world and the old way of life that's in the process of disappearing, as being rendered obsolete by the interrelated forces of capitalism and technology. And again, the irony of the fact is that Trump, in this sense, there's nothing nostalgic about Donald Trump. There's nothing about Donald Trump that reminds one of to use a stereotypical age of American history, the 1950s. He is a dynamic, progressive force in the sense of being linked to the progressive nature of capitalism and technology. But again, he was able, making America great again and speaking in these terms that harken back to a past is this real strong desire for nostalgia that I think comes in any time where you're in a transition, or when you're in a confused transitionatory period moving from one era to another, which we clearly are right now, in the early decades of the 21st century.
Well, many listeners will remember Francis Fukuyama and his, even at the time I thought, frankly ridiculous book, The End of History. And of course that went in the dustbin subsequently. And I think I'm talking now about the idea of where we might be with the capitalist system you've just spoken about. And Fukuyama was proved wrong on certain social and political trends. And there's also the feeling that the capitalist system as it exists, that Trump is so much of a poster boy for, that can progress in only an onward and upward arc. But there's a lot of intelligent people writing about a crisis of capitalism. And this is not really speaking to anything about whether it as a fundamental way of organizing society is good or bad. It's just saying, again, in a lot of the nations that we live in the West and lots of other parts of the world now as well, that system has been churning along and it's running into problems. And that's something else that's very relevant here, but not really acknowledged. And I think that Trump, in some ways, is kind of, again, partly plays a role in that, but he's also, cometh the hour, cometh the man, that he's the perfect type of president for this sort of interim period where we're kind of waiting to see what happens next, because he's,
sure.
This lack of, for all his plans and everything, it's like, what has he actually done? He's kind of a placeholder in some ways, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, in terms of bringing up Fukuyama, his phrase, the end of history, he developed in the mid-1990s, which was essentially trying to map out the new coordinates of the world after the collapse of communism. And the end of history is basically just this idea that the world is now governed by two interrelated principles, the first being liberal democracy, the second being free market capitalism. As that has progressed since the fall of communism, you've seen capitalism as we once knew it in the industrial period morph into what we could call the neoliberal model, the globalized model. And this model has two distinct features in the way that I see it. The first is the idea that capitalism has extended itself over its traditional domain. And a way to think about this quite easily is that capitalism used to be confined by both time and place. It was confined in time by the work shift, the traditional 9-to-5 work shift. And it was confined in place by the perimeter of the factory or the perimeter of the office building. And it was confined to just economic production. What has happened since then is that capitalism has, the logic of capitalism now applies to everything. I mean, a perfect example is Facebook, how friendship was always separate from the logic of capitalism. It was a totally separate domain that had nothing to do with productivity or profit or anything else, or branding. Whereas today, friendship, in terms of how it exists on Facebook, is very much part of the capitalist machinery. So that's the first thing, is that, and then, you have a smartphone. You can be working from your house, working from a coffee shop, working at midnight. Capitalism has extended itself beyond its traditional confines, beyond its traditional mode of economic productivity, and now kind of proliferates almost like a gas throughout society. The British theorist Mark Fisher gave this wonderful term to it. He called it capitalist realism. And it's this idea that the logic of capitalism now mediates everything, not just economics. It mediates culture and our public spaces and our social interactivity. That's the first part of the neoliberal model. The second part, which is related to the first, is how technology is mediating all of this capitalist equivalence and exchange, this capitalist interactivity. So whereas before the 90s, capitalism was contained. It was contained inside the office building. It was contained in the mines. It was contained in the factory, so on and so forth. What's happened since then is that it has spread through society through material technology such as networks and satellites and smartphones and all these things that we use right now, that are affecting our lives almost exclusively on an unconscious basis. So that has created, or is in the process at least, of creating a crisis. And I think, in one sense, I do think Donald Trump is very much in the spirit of that. But in another sense, he's against it because, the one thing that neoliberal style capitalism doesn't want is a wall. That's the last thing it wants. It wants complete open borders. It wants to be able to move and flow and circulate throughout society. So the way that I described it in my book is that Trump wants neoliberalism minus the globalization. In other words, he wants a very intense form of capitalist productivity, but he wants it contained within a nationalist boundary. And of course, you can't do that anymore. And the reason why you can't do that anymore is because the very logic of capital has produced the networks and the satellites and all of the other microelectronic technologies, even now with quantum computing and the emergence of artificial intelligence and mass automation. These things don't recognize national borders. These things don't recognize boundaries, symbolic boundaries in the way that generate meaning for human beings. So he is a bit of a conundrum in the sense that he doesn't even really understand how things are working. Like he's just shooting from the hip. So that is definitely a paradox. Again, we see all these paradoxes with Trump, and this is another one. In one sense, he embodies the most radical element of dynamic neoliberal capitalism, and in another sense, he wants to put the brakes on it by building a concrete wall across the southern border of the United States of America.
Well, I suppose there was a time in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union where the idea was, particularly in America, is that, American values would then percolate around the world slowly but surely. That, it wouldn't matter if there weren't borders because in some sense, America would be everywhere and, there would be no enemies. But of course, it hasn't worked out like that.
No, it hasn't at all worked out like that, and not even close. So that was, very positive thinking, you could say, or wishful thinking, and it didn't work out like that at all. And I think maybe part of the problem is that a lot of the people who were in power in the 1990s, maybe they didn't quite realize the length that a process like capitalism could go in determining the experience of day-to-day life for human beings. That, the way things are now, that was probably unthinkable to someone like, let's say, Alan Greenspan in the 1990s. Actually, one of my favorite filmmakers is the British documentarian Adam Curtis in terms of documentary film. And he's made a series of really wonderful films. And one of my favorites is a film called All Watched Over by the Machines of Loving Grace. Like most of his films, it's a several-part series. And I think in part one of that particular film, it deals with this very thing we're talking about in terms of the mid-1990s, which kind of led to the situation that we're in right now when Bill Clinton came to power. When Bill Clinton was elected and became president in 1993, when he became president, he had all these kind of high-minded, traditional democratic ideas about government programs for society and so on and so forth. And when he came in, Alan Greenspan and Robert Rubin was the Treasury Secretary and Greenspan was the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, they basically told him, you can't do that anymore. The market is going to be dictating pretty much everything now. And all of these old-fashioned democratic government interventions and programs and so on and so forth weren't really going to work in this new model of I guess you could say capitalism that was in the process of becoming very, very powerful in the 1990s as it became linked with computational technology. So what you see then is the gestational period of Fisher's terminology, capitalist realism, where everything in society is reduced to its utility and its potential for economic productivity and therefore profit. And now it's, of course, it's data and all of these different things in terms of information that can be generated just from, I mean, this Skype call right now that we're having right now, this is data. This is information that a company like Skype, and they're owned by Microsoft, they have access to that now. So it's this idea that everything and anything can be quantified and monetized. And that itself is what I think people, I don't necessarily think they can theorize it and articulate it the way I just did, but this is something that people are most certainly don't like. And we'll see how much I mean, someone like Bernie Sanders, his part of his campaign is pushing back against this onslaught of technological and corporate power against human beings. So we'll see what happens. I mean, the next decade is a very critical decade in terms of flushing out the relationship between the power of technology and what will become of the human race.
Just to briefly touch upon the politics of gender and race and identity, that might sound like a completely separate discussion, but where do you see the intersection, if you pardon the pun, of all of that with what's happening, what we've been discussing? Because those are things, that Trump and all politicians have to have opinions on now, and they're being stoked and aggravated in many ways by what's happening in politics. And politics is also responding to it or attempting to. So it's like another set of variables and complicating factors in the mix that are often not helpful, but also they're serving as a tremendous distraction. And this is making no value judgment about any of the content of these topics. That's just, it's my statement about it from my point of view.
Yeah, I didn't get that at all. I think that speaking about these things, this is a very complicated conversation, and it's almost an entirely different interview. And there's a lot to say in this. But I think what has happened, and again, I think someone like Bernie Sanders is kind of pushing back on that. But I think what has happened is that these questions of identity, right, and when they're articulated in political terms, we speak of them as identity politics. They have been severed in many ways from class. It's like we're speaking about race and gender and sexuality as being not related to economics and class differential. And I think that is what has gotten people so hot and heavy about all these different things. Neoliberalism has been, for all intents and purposes, quite sensitive to these issues. I mean, Madison Avenue, Wall Street, Fortune 500 companies, I mean, they've all been very, you could say, woke. But what they're not woke about is basic economic difference, the basic class consciousness. So I think there's been again, the problematic is how identity has been severed from class. I think that's the problematic. And I think someone like Bernie Sanders is trying to relink these two in a very new way. So yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Okay. One other question about factors rarely acknowledged in all of this. But this is a theme that I pick up in all sorts of diverse interviews, but it comes back again and again. From my perspective, and not only mine, there are kind of meta trends occurring across the entire world, and these affect the environment. They affect economies in terms of the global economic structure and the flaws and weaknesses within it. They concern energy availability and production going forward, and how sustainable the industrial societies that many of us live in and benefit from, and that the rest of the people around the world who do not currently benefit from, most of whom would like to be part of, to what extent that is coming unstuck, and what in technology, whatever the developments are, that aside, what things will look like in future. And I constantly hear politicians struggling with issues that a lot of light can be thrown onto these issues if you consider some of these meta trends, but they're assiduously ignored, or people are just ignorant about them. So essentially, I just wanted to get your take on that. I see these just big trends that are, regardless of your political affiliation, your opinions, your desires, any of that, these things are occurring, and they're often as not being factored into political equations.
Sure. I mean, the rate of change that we have been experiencing over the past 20 years is unbelievable. I mean, if we know anything about technology, that change will get even quicker as in the next 20 years. And I think just a lot of people can't deal with it. I think a lot of people right now are just kind of in their own little world. They're trying to get by on a day-to-day level. And that goes for a lot of politicians too. I mean, it's very hard to have this kind of grand view of the world right now. It's very, very difficult. And the reason why it's so difficult is because we're getting, on a very practical level, we're getting bombarded constantly all day long with flows of information and memes and social media messages and news reports. And the structure of the global media apparatus today is so overwhelming that it's very hard to think through all of that. So with the changes that are coming in the immediate future, artificial intelligence, in the global ecological crisis, continuing automation, more and more questions about what we talked about before, identity and identity politics. I think we need right now more than ever is a broad vision of the world, a broad vision of the human race in the 21st century. But unfortunately, we really haven't been getting that from our politicians. And because Trump, he doesn't by any means offer a broad view of things, but he offers a condensed, simplified view in soundbite format that people can digest and understand. So I think from that capacity that he has in terms of his ability to communicate through these new technological mediums, that is what mobilized his political rise.
Well, you said towards the top of the hour, you mentioned 9/11, and you said, of course, you didn't feel that the election of Donald Trump was in any way comparable to that. The only way I would compare the two is simply in terms of temporal historical markers. Something profound does change in the wake of them, and there isn't really any going back in that sense. What I'm thinking here is whenever Donald Trump's presidency comes to an end, whether it's after this term or whether he's re-elected, I find it really difficult to have a vision of what the landscape looks like after that post-Trump.
Yeah.
Can we really go back to business as usual with what, Republicans and Democrats in the US, or even here in the UK and in other liberal democracies with the political shake-ups that are happening? So it's just trying to imagine what that might look like. Can there really be a time when Donald Trump's presidency was just seen as a little temporary aberration, a small blip in history?
Well, I do think that the Democratic Party, their strategy in 2020 is trying to do exactly what you just said, portraying the presidency of Donald Trump as just a blip on the radar. And we have to go back to quote unquote American values and all of the things that made us strong. I mean, I think, it's almost the same as the presidency of Donald Trump. First of all, I don't think you can associate or reduce the presidency of Trump to himself. There were a series of political and economic and technological factors that opened the space where someone like him could even become president. So this idea that is very popular amongst the Democrats of blaming all the problems on Trump is something that I just don't agree with at all. And it's something that I critiqued in my book very strongly. So for me, no, there is no going back without question. And you can almost, it's almost like being traumatized. You can't go back. You can learn and integrate and heal, but then ultimately you have to go forward. And I think, one of the things that Donald Trump does, and I think this is the reason why all these unexpected people, like a perfect example would be Slavoj Žižek, one of the great contemporary European philosophers. He supported Trump over Clinton, not literally, but in the sense that Clinton was just keeping with the status quo, and where Trump, he opened up a space for something new to occur, some kind of new political reality to emerge. What Trump does is he opens up the possibility where we can see all of these inconsistencies, we can see all these paradoxes, all these hypocrisies that are part of the system itself, not the Republican, not the Democrat, but are inscribed into the heart of the political reality in America. Unfortunately, it seems the opposite is happening, is that both sides are hunkering down into their bunker and just doing kind of political warfare. And you saw that very clearly with yesterday's impeachment of Trump. I mean, the voting was almost exactly on party lines. And it's almost like I was watching some of the speeches on the House floor yesterday, and just the absolute differentiation in reality that each side had was staggering, to see how different and radically different their point of view was regarding the charges and the impeachment procedure of Trump. So I don't think there's any going back. There can't be any going back. I mean, Trump opened up so many wounds. He effaced the symbolic dignity of the presidency in ways that it's just really not possible to kind of pretend that he wasn't there. He is a memory that is absolutely inscribed into the consciousness and unconsciousness of American society. So you have to go forward, and what will happen is we don't know right now.
Well, I mean, regarding the impeachment process, I think the Democrats are not careful. They're going to be doing Trump's work for him. But yeah, I mean, it's what you're describing in terms of like opening up a space. It's kind of like a cleansing fire in a way. You know, you maybe like burn down, scrubland or whatever, and then nature takes over and there's new growth and everything renews itself. And certainly Trump has spoken himself in similar terms and, in terms of like draining the swamp and what have you. I mean, going forward, because as you say, that's all there is to do. What do you see as some of the key threats and promise, whether, just in your professional opinion or how you personally feel about it? What worries you maybe, or what gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope is always the same thing, and it's just the basic decency of human beings. I mean, I've been all around the world myself. I've been to many, many, many countries, and I met many, many people from all different walks of life. And, I find that for the overwhelming majority, human beings, people, they're nice. They want good things to happen. So that's always what I keep in mind as being positive. It's just the basic decency of the majority of human beings living on planet Earth. In terms of what worries me, I would say without question the structure of global technology in the present moment. I think we don't really have a grasp on it, both in practical terms, but certainly in understanding what exactly is happening. And I think in particularly what has to be theorized or flushed out and made and explained to people in very matter-of-fact terms is the ongoing integration between global capitalism and global technology. I think that right there is the key point of contention over the next couple decades, and how that develops is literally going to determine the future of the human race. I don't like to speak in such dramatic terminology, but I think that is probably an understatement, is how technology and capitalism, which are developing almost as a singularity right now, how that develops over the next couple of decades is going to determine so much. And at some point, there is going to have to be some kind of political intervention that steps in and regulates or modifies or controls or slows down this rapidly developing process. So that's the real concern that I have. And then there's hope. I think there's always hope, man. I'm one of these, I try to be a positive in life, in my personal life, and in terms of how I see the world in the big picture. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's nothing else for it, really, is my attitude. Today, Brian, we've been discussing, amongst other things, your recent book, The Meaning of Trump. That's available everywhere, easy to get. Just before we sign off, share with listeners details of your website and anything else you'd like to put out there.
Yeah, like I said, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on. I've enjoyed this conversation. My name is, like I said, it's Brian Francis Culkin. My website is www.brianculkin.com. You can find all of my books, my film work, and upcoming projects that I'm working on.
Well, once again, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizedfreedom.com.
Thank you very much for having me, Greg.